Hello, everybody. It's sweater weather here in the Pacific Northwest. We're having a big storm here today, but I'm Katrina Walker, and so I'm thrilled to be in the studio with you. But just if if something happens, it's probably because my internet crashed because of the storm. But that's okay. We'll probably be just fine, and we'll have a great time together because today we're going to be talking about some specialty techniques for working with are heavier specialty fabrics. So, there's a lot of different kinds of specialty fabrics, and I don't want any of you to ever be afraid to sew something because you're intimidated by your fabric. You be the boss of your fabric, be the boss every time. So, just to remind you, there is a download for you that has written instructions for the techniques I'm going to be teaching you today. So I'm going to be teaching you how to do 2 different seams and a seam finish for some of those heavier specialty fabrics that maybe might have you a little bit stumped or have you a little intimidated. So make sure you can get that QR code and you can go ahead and get that download so that you don't have to spend your precious time taking too many notes. Now, of course, the great thing is this is recorded. You can watch it again if you want, but make sure that you get your download so you have all of your written instructions already done for you. So that's my little gift for you. I'm just checking my screen because I'll be seeing any comments or any questions you might have will be popping up there in the chat for me. So I'll be keeping my eye on that in case you have any questions throughout, or if you just want to say hello, because I know that you're tuning in from all over the world, and that's always super exciting. So hello from the stormy Pacific Northwest, where we have what they call a cyclone bomb circling around off our coastline. Okay, so anyhow, specialty fabrics. And I wanted to share with you some design tips for working with some of these because preparation can also be really important. So before we get into some of these construction techniques, I wanted to make sure to give you some pointers on how to work with them. And one is using this as a project I'm currently working on. So I've been on this design kick lately of making jackets. Whoops, wrong one. Making jackets from Japanese obi. So actually, this is a front piece. This will be a back piece. They have sometimes these really great border designs and things that you can use to. There'll be actually a zipper here, but anyway, I was lucky that I have a little crop jacket pattern I can just squeeze out a jacket from it. But one thing to be aware of, if you're going to work with some of these heavier specialty fabrics, like Japanese obi. So if you're not familiar with that term, an obi is when in traditional Japanese dress, when someone wears a kimono, the obi is that big wide belt that goes around their midsection and is extremely elegant. They're usually woven from these beautiful heavy brocades. And I have a ton of them because I'm kind of obsessed. So I finally put my money where my mouth is and started making clothes out of them. But another thing to consider with some of these fabrics is think about judicious use of this material. Now, this is an obi jacket that's already been constructed. Well, one thing I found out that might be helpful to know is that even if this is not the same pattern, but it's kind of similar, kind of a cropped style. But when I went to lay out the fabric for this, I found out that the plaid is not actually even. So this is meant to be worn again as a belt. It's a very much a one-of-a-kind art fabric. And I was thinking that it was even, but it's not. You see how the stripes actually on this side, the stripes, there's different numbers of them. And so it really made layout a little challenging because I'm one of those people that wants all my plaids to be perfectly aligned, right? And good to see you, everybody. So in this case, I didn't actually have enough fabric to do the back. So some of these specialty fabrics are very narrow. So you have to be really strategic about what patterns you choose for them. And one way to work around it is to use patterns that have princess seams. Princess seams are seams that intersect the apex of the body. So it splits the design up into usually at least 8 pieces. So that helps a lot. If you can use 8 pieces instead of 2 or 3 or 4, that helps a lot. Other things you can do is just use coordinating fabrics to mix in with the design, because this is, again, this is really stiff. It has to be a fairly fitted design, or at least one. It can be one like a denim jacket actually is a great example for something to use with stiff fabrics. And that's not necessarily fitted, it's kind of boxy. So boxy works and fitted works. So you have to think about the fact that a lot of these designs don't drape well. That's why they're great for evening gown bustiers and things, right? They're great for for doing a strapless top because they're not going to fall down on you. They are stiff. So think about that. And so another reason I'm pointing this out is these kind of fabrics don't make very wearable sleeves sometimes. They're just too stiff. So think instead about using, again, a coordinating fabric, and you can use some of your beautiful decorative fabric just to do a cuff, a coordinating cuff. You know, cuffs and collars, always great ways to decorate your fabrics. So anyway, so I just wanted to give you a little heads up on some of the difficulties that we have with these fabrics and maybe help you with some of your designing. And hello, we have people from Toronto and New York and Iowa. So lots of North America representation. Good to see you all. So another thing we have to look at too is marking these fabrics can be extremely challenging. So here we have the back of my proposed jacket project. You can see I used a lot of chalk to try to get start. I have large shoulder blades, so a pretty significant shoulder dart and a pretty significant waist dart to make room for this big mass I have right here on my center back, or on each side of my center back. I have a custom dress form, and the dress form maker says, "Oh, you have wings." So yeah, I have to make room for my wings. So anyhow, with these brocade fabrics, you see the way they're woven? There's a lot of floats. And what I mean by float is it's where the thread literally has to cross over sections of the fabric to make it from one side to the other. And with the jacquard, these are done on what's called a jacquard loom. And a jacquard loom is pretty amazing in that it literally can control every single thread in the loom, in the warp direction, can be controlled individually. So you actually do photographs in fabric with a jacquard loom. They're pretty awesome. But what happens with a jacquard is you do get floats. You'll get these floats on the backside. Those aren't super sturdy. So I strongly recommend when you're working with these fabrics, now I went ahead and marked this with darts just so you could see how difficult it is to do that and have it actually be visible. It's really hard to see when you're sewing like that. So I strongly recommend that instead, now I haven't bothered to mark the darts on this one yet, but on this front piece, you can see I've used a fusible interfacing. Now this is an extremely lightweight fusible interfacing. This is called Perfect Fuse. It's Perfect Fuse Light, I think. Anyhow, but this Perfect Fuse Light is extremely lightweight, very thin interfacing. You can see that it's very sheer. And it doesn't change the hand, it doesn't change the drape of this fabric, but what it does is it seals it. So it seals all those threads. This is actually smoother. So this is actually, I haven't decided yet, but that pattern is an unlined jacket. And I may leave it unlined just for the sake of it not being too hot to wear. Because sometimes when I'm teaching, the classrooms are very warm. So I don't always choose to line. And so I may leave this unlined, and this using a lightweight fusible interfacing doesn't make it bulky, but it does help to kind of seal the fabric in so that these threads in the floats don't tend to get snagged, and the fabric will wear better. It'll last longer with repeated wear. The other advantage of putting this fusible interfacing on is that when I go ahead and go to mark my darts, you know, it should be a lot easier to see what I'm doing, right? So it'll be much easier for me to mark my darts using whatever method I choose to use. I'll probably use a tracing wheel and carbon paper, but still, it'll actually show up much better against the white, lightweight, fusible interfacing than it would against this brocade that has a whole lot going on. So I just highly recommend that you consider using, for any of these real specialty fabrics, use a good quality, lightweight, fusible interfacing. To go ahead and just give it a little bit more support, and it just actually increases the wearability. Okay. So I again, we just wanted to give you a couple tips to help you to be more successful working with these fabrics. So let's get to the actual seaming techniques. So I have two different seaming techniques to share with you. One is for fabrics that fray, and one is for fabrics that don't fray. Because some specialty fabrics, they might be a heavy knit, like a boiled wool. So boiled wool is actually a knit fabric. It's been knit and then shrunk. That's boiled wool, how it's made. It could be, again, it could be an ultra suede or faux suede, or there's a lot of different fabrics out there that just don't fray. And so we have a technique for them as well. But some of these, like the brocades, do fray. I'm going to show you that technique first. Okay, so again, this is in your handout that you can download, all of these different techniques. But I'm going to start with what's called a welt seam. And welt seams are used in where we actually see a lot of welt seams, and I forgot to go grab one, is we see welt seams actually used in a lot of heavy coating. So welt seams are something that we'll see in pea coats, navy pea coats. A lot of navy pea coats are sewn with a welt seam, and they're sewn with a welt seam rather than, say, a flat felled seam because they're not as bulky. So this is the key is that, again, this is some scraps of brocade from my jacket project. And the key is that some of our specialty fabrics, our heavier ones, are too bulky to use a self-finished seam like like a flat-felled seam or a French seam. So this is an alternative that is also very attractive and will hold its shape very well. All right, so let's go to the machine here. So we're just going to be sewing this right sides together. So I better flip this over. Now, I didn't interface this, obviously, but that's okay. This is just for show. So I'm just going to sew. I usually use just a regular 2.5 stitch length. We're using 2.5 stitch length. We're just using a just regular. I actually prefer polyester thread for construction because polyester thread is less likely to fail. I live in a very dry climate. So if you try to use I do sometimes use silk for construction, but polyester thread does hold up better in the long run. It's not my favorite fiber, but it has its place. And in my mind, its place is holding my clothes together. I've actually had garments that were, manufactured garments that were sewn with cotton thread that have rotted out, literally dry rotted. So I'm not a big fan of natural fiber threads other than maybe silk for really specialty garments. But anyhow, so just straight stitch, regular seam width, whatever your seam allowance is. Remember to check your seam. If you're working especially with independent pattern companies, make sure to check what the seam allowance actually is. Some of them aren't standard. Okay, so I'm just going to have my machine cut my threads. And so there's just my standard 5/8 inch seam. Okay. Now, one of the reasons we're using this seam instead, you might be thinking, well, why aren't we just sewing like a normal seam? Well, some of these fabrics, here's my seam stick. It doesn't even want to lay flat. See, it's really resisting this whole seaming thing. Okay, now I do actually like to try to press them open if I can. Let me wake up my iron here. There we go. It goes to sleep while it's waiting for me to quit talking. So I'm pressing on what's called a seam stick. And a seam stick is a piece of half round hardwood. So it needs to be, maple or oak. I think they're usually maple is most common. You want a type of wood has a real dense grain so it doesn't absorb the moisture too much. So I'm pressing this open, and the reason I'm pressing this open, even though eventually I'm going to press to the side, is just to give myself a flatter seam to start with. And a seam stick, what the seam stick lets me do is press just the seam without embedding the seam allowances into my fabric. Okay, so that's why we press on specialty tools when we're doing tailoring. All right. This may seem kind of counterproductive, but I'm now going to press it to one side. Again, the reason I went ahead and pressed it open first, because number one, it did actually cooperate and let me do that when all was said and done. Amazing what steam can do. But also, I wanted to make sure that I had a nice flat seam. So if you can, press it open. If not, don't worry about it. But a weld seam is meant to be something that's very strong and self-finishing. So I'm going to press to one side. And I'm generally going to press toward the back of the garment for this particular seam. If it was, say, sewing a front to a back. Okay. So once my welt seam, I shouldn't have rested my iron. It's discolored my cotton on my pressing board. Anyhow, so once you have your welt seam pressed to one side, and by the way, this could be a serged seam. If you have a serged seam that's then top stitched, that could be a welt seam too. But with a welt seam, what we're going to do is we're going to trim the underlayer. So when we press it to one side, there's a top layer and an underlayer. So we're going to trim off that underlayer. And we're just going to trim it to approximately a quarter of an inch. If you want to be really, really careful, you can actually, measure this out, draw yourself a line. I'm just going to eyeball it. Probably a little bit wide there. But I'm not going to worry too much about it. Because now what I'm going to do, so I've trimmed my underlayer about in half. Now, if we were going to do a flat filled seam, and I'll answer your question, Arlene, in just a second. If we're going to do a flat filled seam, we would actually wrap the seam allowance around the lower seam allowance and stitch it. I could have done this on the front side of the fabric. But the problem is that this brocade is really thick and heavy. It doesn't really want to do that. I'm going to use a welt seam because welt seams, because you might be thinking, why wouldn't you just do a flat fill? Well, because welt seams are less bulky. They're less bulky. And again, the whole story here is that we're working with the thicker fabrics. Okay, so now that I have this trimmed, I'm now going to top stitch from the right side to just enclose that. Now this is not going to be the prettiest seam in this case because I didn't pre-finish the seam allowance. So bear that in mind that this would be more appropriate in a lined garment if I wasn't going to go ahead and pre-finish this. Now I could go ahead and I could pink that. I could have serged it before construction. A lot of things I could have done. So in case you're wondering. Now, question asked, great question. Is there any project that back stitches aren't required? The reason we backstitch at the beginning and end of a seam is actually just to keep that seam from unraveling during the process of construction. The reality is that most of our construction seams are actually going to eventually be crossed by a facing or a hem or something like that. So it's really kind of that backstitch at the beginning of the seam is really more of just a security measure than anything. So actually quilters, for example, when quilters are doing piecing, they don't usually bother to backstitch. Okay, a lot of times they just sew that seam, onto the next thing, and it's eventually all going to be, not only is it going to have cross seams, but they're also going to be, what do I say? It's going to be quilted as well. I'm one of those people that I'm going to backstitch no matter what, but backstitching really is more just of a security measure than anything else. It's just to keep the thread from unraveling between the time you sewed that seam and before that seam gets intersected by another garment piece, like I said, because most seams at the end, they're going to get turned up into a hem, or they're going to have a facing sewn on or something like that. So a very good question. Okay. So now we have, make sure that you know whoops, wrong button. Hang on. There we go. Okay. So now here's our seam and there's our trimmed seam allowance. So we just want to make sure that we're going to be enclosing that other seam allowance inside there. Now you can use a guide foot. I'm just going to use the edge of my presser foot as a guide. Use whatever works for you. When I say guide foot, I'll show you what I mean. I think I have one here. I do. So a lot of sewing machine companies make feet, and you can usually buy these generically too, but they make feet. This one happens to be adjustable, so you can set it for whatever width you want. There's others that more set that just have markings on them. So at any rate, these exist out there. I'm just going to cheat. I'm just going to, here, I'll backstitch even. There we go. I'm just going to top stitch. But the idea here is that it's going to go ahead and finish that seam so that raw edge underneath is enclosed. Even though this is a fabric that frays, having that one row of stitching there will keep that seam from failing long term. So this is an extremely strong seam, and it's much flatter than a flat fill. So the difference between a welt seam and a flat fill is that it's not, the welt seam isn't turned under, so that makes it flatter. It also has just one row of stitching, whereas usually on a flat fill we see 2 rows of stitching. Okay, so again, that's the welt seam. You want to sew just a regular seam. I like to press it open if I can, but you're going to press it to one side. You're going to trim the underlayer, which I did enclose, trim the underlayer, and then top stitch it from the right side to just enclose everything. So again, this would be okay if this was an unlined, excuse me, if this was a lined garment, the lining's going to cover up that icky raw edge. Now I could have used a serger to finish that, but I'm going to be teaching you a seam finish here in a bit. So I'm just going to leave it as it is. But I wanted to show you, for those of you, I keep saying flat fill. So for those of you who aren't familiar with what that is, here's a jacket with a flat filled seams. So again, a flat filled seam is going to have, this is a pretty wide fill, but a flat filled seam has 2 rows of stitching showing. And some of you might be wondering about, on that welt seam, you might be wondering about trimming that seam, about clipping it. I usually find that actually even on a lot of welt seams, even on flat felt seams, there I go again. Even on flat felt seams, you don't necessarily have to, unless it's a real extreme curve, it's usually okay. It just depends on your fabric. I find that a lot of people are way over clipping their seams. If that princess seam isn't real extreme, you shouldn't be, for most seams, you don't need to clip within a 1/4 of an inch of that seam allowance. You might, again, let's use quilting as an example. They don't clip their curves because they're only a 1/4 inch seam. So on most fabrics, if that seam allowance, and like French seams too, you can usually do at least a gentle curve in French seams without any problems. So when you clip those curves, only clip just as much as the fabric tells you it needs to do. And don't clip too close in, or you can cause your seams to fail. And if they fail, you have no fabric to work with because it's been clipped. So sorry, that's been on my mind a lot lately. I just wanted to say something about it. Just a lot of people over clipping. I guess maybe we're going to have to, maybe we'll have coming up in the future, we'll have a little episode on sewing princess seams. I think that might be a good topic. How to walk in a seam and how to clip them effectively. Okay, so the second seaming technique I'd like to teach you is how to do a lapped seam. Now, lapped seams we'll see on a lot of, again, faux suede. Faux suede is one. So this is fabrics that don't fray and don't press easily. All right, so we have sometimes fabrics that don't press easily. This is actually a couple pieces of lightweight neoprene. So neoprene is a knit fabric. They also call it scuba knit for obvious reasons, because they make scuba suits out of neoprene. So I'm probably going to be making some rash guards out of this myself, but also scuba knits have been very popular for sewing jackets that you can do like a faux quilted jacket by stitching on it, because that spongy thickness of the neoprene, the stitches just kind of sink right in, and you can get some really cool textural effects with it. But anyhow, one of the issues of working with a fabric like neoprene is that it does not want to press. Okay, it's just, it's if you try to fold it, it's just gonna, unless you melt it, it's probably not going to work very well. So this is why a lapped seam works well for it. You can use a welt seam that we just did with it, because again, you're going to press it to one side and stitch it down. If you do a welt seam on this stuff, I recommend using glue stick. Just like I like, just good old this brand. Probably not supposed to say brand names, so any rate, but this is what I use. I would glue stick it down, and I'm actually going to be using that here shortly anyway. So, okay. So to do a lapped seam, again, remember this is in your notes, so you don't have to remember everything I say, which is always good. So let me just get my, first thing we're going to do with a welt seam, we'll see if this actually, let me use chalk. That's probably going to show up better. With the welt seam, we want to, first thing we want to do is we want to mark the stitching line, mark the seam allowances on it. So this is on the wrong side of the fabric. I guess it kind of shows. Let's see, do I have white here? Nope, I didn't grab white. I have silver. That's okay, we'll make it work. So on the wrong side of the fabric, I'm just going to give myself a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Actually, I'll probably be 5/8 by the time I'm done tracing here. So we're going to mark our stitching line on the wrong side. We're going to do this on both pieces. So again, this is the wrong side. And we're just going to mark that stitching line. Okay. So here's our stitching line marked on the wrong side of our fabric. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to trim off the seam allowance for one of these because again, so this is our stitching line. So we need to know where that stitching line is to make sure that we have the proper overlap. So the beauty of a lapped seam is that we literally are just going to lap the pieces of fabric and stitch it down. So there's no pressing it open. There's none of that kind of stuff. So again, these fabrics that don't want to behave, that don't want to be pressed, and they don't fray, this is a great option. So your boiled wools, you can use this with your boiled wools too. But again, the welt seam I showed you also works really well with boiled wool. Okay, so what I'm going to do is go ahead and smear. Doesn't have to be a ton of it, but just smear a little glue stick within the stitching line on the other side. This is just starch, basically. It washes right out. Kids have been known to eat it. Yuck. But I've never had problems with it damaging my fabric. So I'm just going to stick that down. And so there's my lap. Okay, so now we're going to take it to the machine and we're just going to stitch this down. Now we need to stitch along each raw edge. So front and back to hold this in place. I'll just put this on the close up here. So see how they're overlapping here? So we're going to stitch down one edge and the other edge to hold it all in place. Again, you see this a lot on like faux leather jackets and things, and leather jackets. Whoops. There we go. Okay. So in terms of distance, where to line up your foot, I could just go ahead and put on an edge stitching foot. These are feet that have a blade down the center. So those are really handy. And so I just move my needle. I'm going to move my needle a little bit to the left so that I know I'm catching that edge. And we're just going to edge stitch that in place. Now I'm just using a plain old straight stitch. I'm just using regular stitch length because I'm just using standard, pretty thin sewing thread. If you want this to be more decorative, use a heavier thread and a longer stitch. And you want to use a top stitching needle ideally. Sewing on neoprene, I didn't change my needle. In reality at home, if I was doing this for real, I would probably put in a stretch needle. So a stretch needle is for fabrics that you tend to get skip stitches. And neoprene's a real prime example of that. But this is just, a little sample so you can see the technique. But just FYI, if I was doing this for real on neoprene, now I also would do some sample stitching. Like this is really close to the edge. I think that when I do the other side, I'm actually going to move my needle over even more. Well, actually, I'll probably stitch from the other side, but do some test swatches. Like I said, this is too close to the edge. I should move my needle over even more. That's, way too close. I think it would look better if I'd come inbound, maybe a 1/16 of an inch, maybe an 1/8 of an inch. But this is all normal stuff. You should always be testing these kinds of seams to make sure you like the way it looks before you actually sew your garment. So, all right, now I am doing directional stitching. So this is where I think this is where I started. So, but I'm going to move that needle over a lot farther this time. I know I didn't bother to backstitch that time. It's just a sample. Okay, so that looks better. So I moved my needle inbound a little bit. I think that looks nicer. You want to try to keep the goal is to keep these rows of stitching parallel as much as you can. Like I said, it would look better if I had done I think come inbound a little bit more. That stitching would have looked straighter too, because it's so close to the edge in places that it's kind of slipping. So just bear that in mind. Do your samples, check to make sure that everything is the way that you want it to look. Okay, but that is a lapped seam. And that's the beauty of it, is that it's flat, it's strong because it's double stitched. I didn't use stretching thread, but actually this is, sufficiently strong, even on neoprene knit. It's very strong and it's very flat. Now you might be thinking, well, why didn't you just use a serger and flat lock that? Well, I certainly could have. I could have flat locked this on the serger. I could have done a welt seam where I stitched my seam, laid it over to one side, trimmed it, and then stitched it down. So this just gives, you have a lot of options. So it's good to learn as many seaming techniques as you can, just so that you can make the most of your projects. It's okay to choose a variety of techniques. All right, so that's the lapped seam. Now let's go back to, we're going to revisit the welt seam, because I'm going to show you how to do next a seam finish that's really beautiful for our unlined garments, and that's a Hong Kong seam finish. So actually the silk jacket I showed you, even though it has flat felled seams, there are some seams inside of it that aren't flat fells. So for instance, it has a contrast pleat in here. So it's a contrasting color that was actually seamed in to be a pleat, because why not? And so that seam has actually been finished with a Hong Kong seam finish. Now, a Hong Kong seam finish is basically a bound seam finish. Let me put this on the closer overhead here. So a Hong Kong seam finish is basically like a bound seam finish, but the difference is the back side of a Hong Kong seam finish is flat. Okay, it's flat. So let me actually pull the sleeve, because the sleeve has a seam on the top that ends with a slit, so it's not flat filled. So here we have more of a standard, oops, let me get that exposure down for you a little bit. There we go. Okay, so here we have, your basic pressed open seam. So the seam was stitched, it was pressed open, and then we did a Hong Kong finish on it, or I should say I did a Hong Kong seam finish on it, because it's very attractive. and it finishes the seams. Now this is for seams that's going to be pressed open, so no one's going to see the fact that on the back side, this bias has just been trimmed so that it's not too wide for that seam allowance. Okay, whereas now here on this is a store-bought jacket that has bound seams. So I'll show you the difference. So this is a little, it's actually a terry knit. I love this jacket. It's a terry knit jacket and it has bound seam allowances. And you know, bound seam allowances are an option too. I prefer Hong Kong because they're flatter. So again, a Hong Kong seam finish is not as bulky. Now they use a really lightweight fabric. But see, on a bound finish, the edges are actually turned under on both sides. So it's bulkier. So along this edge, you have, you know, 2, 3, 4, 5 layers of fabric. Whereas on a Hong Kong, you have 4 layers. So it's another way to do it. There's nothing wrong with it. I will say that usually if you're going to bind a seam like this, you're going to do this with a binder before you sew your garment together. All right, so it's easiest if you finish your seam allowances first and then go ahead and bind them. But that's the difference between a bound seam finish and a Hong Kong. And I'm going to show you Hong Kong because it's faster, easier, and flatter. Okay, so again, just to show you, this is a Hong Kong finish. Now, the Hong Kong finish, I also use a lot to finish the edges of other things, like this cuff has been finished with the Hong Kong finish, and hems. So here's another design tip. When you are sewing a hem in something bulky, consider, instead of turning up a hem, cut a faced hem. So a faced hems are cut to the shape of the garment. So in this case, I have flat felled seams on this Dupioni. Dupioni is not real heavy, so I don't count it as a heavy fabric, but there's still characteristics. It's fairly stiff. It's not drapey. But by cutting a faced hem, we don't have to turn up, you know, all of those flat felled seams. Instead, we can cut a nice smooth hem with minimal seaming along the bottom of the jacket. It's just a much nicer. And if you have a big, like a skirt with a, you know, a big circled hem, a full long skirt tends to have a very curved hem. Do yourself a favor and cut a facing for it. Okay, it's so much easier if you just cut that hem to fit your garment rather than having to, you know, ease in that upper surface. But anyhow, this is a faced hem on this jacket, and I finished it with a Hong Kong seam finish. So pretty much any time now, I pretty much do all my hem finishes with a Hong Kong. I just think it looks nice. It's nice to stitch into. It kind of softens the edge of the hem. It's all good. There's nothing bad about it. Okay, so how is it done? Well, we're going to start by just sewing a seam. So we need a seam so we can finish it, obviously. My fabric's a little kooky. Let me just give a quick press to it. So here's there's the label for this obi. So if any of you read Japanese, you can tell me what that means or what it says. But at any rate, that's the label. So I'm going to start by just giving myself a seam. So I'm going to sew just a regular 5/8 inch seam. You can see this phrase a lot, so it's good that we're going to do a seam finish on it. Okay. Oops, let me change my foot. Hang on. That'd be good. And straighten my needle back out. There we go. That's one of my best tricks. Forgetting to switch my stitch and my foot. Okay, take 2. There we go. 5/8. Okay, we already backstitched, so we're good. Okie doke. So we've sewn our seam, and now I'm going to go ahead and I know I can talk this into pressing open if I want it to. Grab my. I actually accidentally sewed this. In case you caught that, I accidentally sewed it wrong sides together, but we're going to pretend that it was sewn right sides together. It's pretty either way, so we'll just pretend that this was the wrong side and not the right side. Okay. So the Hong Kong finish, you just need a piece of bias. This is probably not the bias I would use. I'd use something. I probably cut it out of silk. You can actually buy rolls of silk bias already pre-cut in white, sometimes black, but you can get it white, and then you can even use you color it yourself. There's a lot of easy silk dyes to use. I like to use a silk dye called Color Hue. It's really easy to use. And so there's, like I said, various ways that we can do this. So you have to think about it. Now, the reason I'm kind of hesitating, so there's a couple different ways we could do this Hong Kong seam finish. Now, if I'm going to sew it in a normal fashion for my seam allowance, I'd sew this right sides together. So this is the wrong side of my seam allowance, right? So when it's pressed open, the back side is the wrong side, and it would be the wrong side of your fabric too. So that's all normal. So right sides, if you just think right sides together, what we're going to do is we're going to sew this and we're going to wrap it around the edge. But now if I was going to do this as a welt seam, I could use this as a trim for a welt seam. In that case, I would actually go ahead and do my Hong Kong finish onto the wrong side and wrap it around, and it would be stitched down like that. So this is a way you can use to also finish a welt seam. I'm just going to show you quickly how to do it on a normal seam. So the normal seam, we're going to sew it right sides together, and we're going to use like about 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, since we already have a 5/8 inch to work with. And again, use a nice, whoops, we're in reverse. There we go. A nicer weight bias, but this is just something I had available. So, but you'll want to stitch some little samples of this first. Again, make sure that you like it. Make sure that you like the way it looks. Okay, so there's my bias has been sewn to my seam allowance, right sides together. Okay, so now this just gets wrapped around that seam allowance. So it just gets wrapped around. So again, here we go. Let me just open this up. So we sewed it just to our seam allowance, not to the fashion fabric, just the seam allowance. We sewed it right sides together. And then we just are going to wrap it around the edge. And I realize this bias is way wide for the seam allowance. It's okay. We'll trim it later. But we're going to just wrap this around. Now notice I didn't pull it so tight that you can't see the bias. You know, one of the mistakes students will make is they pull it so tight it looks like this. You don't want that. You want people to see that beautiful, beautiful finish. But it's very easy. So I'm going to go ahead and now I'm just going to stitch in the ditch. So stitch that in place. And again, we're only going on the seam allowance. Here's all the other layers of my fabric. Let me put on the close up here. So again, we're only stitching on the seam allowance. Only sewing on the seam allowance. All the other layers of fabric are all off to one side. So we're only stitching on the seam allowance. Okay, we're not sewing it to the garment. We're just stitching the seam allowance. So again, sorry, my thumb's kind of ugly today. So again, we sewed it right sides together just to the seam allowance. We wrap it around to the back. And now we're going to what we call stitch in the ditch. Sew along there to secure it. I'm not going to bother switching feet for this. I'm just going to sew it. Okay. So there is, I just stitched in the ditch along that well of the seam. And I just need to trim off all this extra. Okay, I trim off the extra. Let's do that real quick. So bias doesn't fray. So we're not going to worry about that. But there's my Hong Kong seam finish on one side of my seam. So if I want to do the other side, I could do that real quick, since this is a pretty quick technique. You know, a lot of our beautiful couture techniques like this one, they're not necessarily that hard to do. They just take a few extra steps. So again, went ahead and sewed this to the right side of my seam allowance. I'm going to trim off some of that fuzz. Needs a haircut. There we go. So again, sewing only on the seam allowance, not on the fashion fabric. We're just going to wrap it around and stitch it down. Okay, and once more, just trim off that excess. Actually, these duck bills did a great job. And remember, this raw edge is going to be hidden underneath. So all you're going to see on the inside of your jacket is this. You're just going to see this beautiful finished edge inside your jacket. You're not going to see the raw edge underneath because it'll be pressed flat and then it'll be held flat inside the garment. But again, if I was going to do a welt seam, you could apply the Hong Kong to that longer piece of seam allowance, only sew it to the wrong side. You know, and then when you trim this, you can place that over and stitch it down into a welt seam that was self-finished. Okay, that would be very pretty also. So there's lots of ways to do it, but I just find the Hong Kong seam finish to be extremely versatile and very attractive. And as you saw, it's really not difficult to do. It just takes a little time. And yes, you may be wondering now, you know, if I have a serger, can't I just serge things and just serge that seam allowance and then stitch it down? Absolutely. You can use a serger to do kind of a mock welt seam where you serge it, press it to one side, and then top stitch. So it's kind of a mock welt seam that we do with a serger. But not everybody has one. And frankly, there's times when I don't find that to be the most attractive. I find this to be a more attractive seam finish than raw serger edges. You know, that you can have something that really looks nice without a ton of effort. But remember that technique is also just really awesome to use for finishing all of your hems. If you have a turned cuff, what have you, it's a really nice way to go and to dress up your sewing a little bit without really putting that much effort. It's just a couple more steps. So really beautiful. So that is all I intended to cover today. We're getting close to the hour mark here. So I'm going to give you a moment just to see if there's any other questions. But I just, you know, we're getting that season. Everybody is doing, you know, their holiday sewing, and, you know, there's a lot of parties and things coming up for a lot of people. So I hope that you'll find the courage to get out some of those fun fabrics that you've been hanging on to and get them out and make something really fun to wear. And with a lot of these really elaborate fabrics, sometimes the simplest designs are best. So just a really simple design is often the best way to show off some of those fabrics. And don't be afraid to, again, use contrasting fabrics for your sleeves. Why waste a bunch of really expensive fabric on a sleeve when you can just put on a matching cuff and looks very, 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 very intentional, very polished. So Max has put the tips and techniques guide up on the screen for you. If you didn't already get the link for that download, please go ahead and do that. We want you to have those instructions so that it's very easy for you to repeat what we did in class. So I am not seeing any other questions here, so I'm just going to wish everyone so in here in the U.S. Happy Thanksgiving next week. For the rest of you, happy Thanksgiving anyway. I'm grateful for you, so grateful that you are sewing, and I wish you the best. So take care and happy sewing.